Hi everyone, welcome to On the Other Hand. I'm Ariane Zurcher and I am just doing slow stitching today. I'm working on my fifth sphere and it's all about stitching the wound, I'm calling it. And I'll turn you around and you can see why I'm calling it that. Here's my sphere at this point, and now I'm just going to do some stitching. I'm going to put this aside and I'm going to show you what I'm going to do a little slow stitching. I want to just start stitching, but then I found this and I thought, maybe I'll make another one. This is a little cast on rose, bouillon rose. I'm just mapping out some sort of general idea of what I'm thinking. And then I'm going to just start doing some slow stitching. And I kind of like this in here somewhere, but I don't like this hard edge. But I think I can, cover it. And then I love this because it's got like this gold metallic paint on here. And I was thinking I could maybe rip some of it, and then I like the idea of something being torn and then stitching it together again, because this is all about things being torn and stitched together, literally. So I could do something here maybe, and I can also paint some of this later if I felt like it. So maybe I take this out, which is, that old journal, and put, I don't know, maybe I leave that for another time. Maybe I add this, I like that. This is an old collage. I could put that in just like that. Okay, well, I think this is enough to begin. So now I'm just going to start threading up some stuff. I've got this thread and I might just start stitching with this, see where it takes me. So the beautiful thing about slow stitching is you don't think about it. Or I don't think while I'm doing it, I just start stitching. Random. So I'll do some seed stitching here. I wanted to make sure I had lots of colors, pinks and light greens, and with just a little bit of splashes of darker, because this is all about that moment when you've committed to living differently, but you have no idea how to do that. And it feels absolutely overwhelming. So this is all about, I'm not stitching to make something whole. I'm stitching so I don't forget where it tore. I'm stitching as a way to do things differently. And it's a reminder. A reminder of how to do that. It's also something really, really healing about doing something that's very methodical, but that is not destructive. A different kind of obsession. This is where obsession becomes, actually is helpful. There's something really beautiful about obsession. When my daughter was first diagnosed with autism, we listened to all the different people, all of whom claimed to be experts. And I kept asking, but where are all the adult autistic people? And they didn't have answers for that. And so I searched for them and I found them. And those became the people that I relied on most, because after all, that was their neurology and they understood it quite well, even though so-called, autistic neurology, whatever, that means, is as diverse as non-autistic neurology. It's, but I remember I found this wonderful autistic woman named Julia Bascom, and she had written, and her blog was called The Obsessive Joy of Autism? It was a post that she wrote on her blog, and it was called The Obsessive Joy of Autism, and it was such a kind of mind-blowing thing for me to read, because instead of pathologizing, which is what everyone else had been doing, it was talking about the beauty and the joy of this mind that was so different but just as worthy and just as beautiful. And it really opened my eyes. I used to think of obsessiveness as something that needed to be tempered, and now I embrace the obsessiveness. Obsessiveness is a beautiful thing when poured into something that isn't self-destructive. And that was what I had to learn. I had to learn how to live my life with different obsessions, with obsessions that were going to be loving, self-caring. And I thought that was an oxymoron. I didn't realize that there could possibly be something like that. So that's what this stitching for this sphere represents to me. It's the obsessive joy of obsession, and how beautiful that can be, and how that can be a road to survival, and also a way out. And I desperately needed a way out at that moment in my life. I had to find something else that was going to take the place of the self-destructive obsessiveness. So in the other video on gathering materials, I spoke about what I'm calling this next sphere. I'm calling it the floor and the skylight. And I mentioned in that video how I came home and I lay on the floor and I had a skylight in that apartment, 4th floor walk up. It was a great apartment. I loved that apartment. I lived there for 8 years. And I lay on the floor, and it was just at that time of day when the sunlight was coming through, and it hit me, and I felt a very, very brief glimmer, a feeling of, it's going to be okay. And that was all I needed. I just needed that second to propel me forward just for one more day. And that's what I did. One day, just kept it literally one day at a time. And the minute my mind started to race forward, how can I do this? How can I sustain this? It's not possible. I would just breathe and bring myself back to the present and remind myself, you don't have to do the rest of your life right now. You just have to do right now. And that was probably the most significant and powerful message that I then repeated to myself for the next few years, because it took a long time for me to continue to do something that was not punishing, that was healthy. I needed to do that over and over again, one day at a time, for years. For it to really solidify. I still use that when things are really overwhelming. I'll tell myself, you don't have to do this for the rest of your life. You just have to do this for the next 5 minutes. When my mom died, and then after my kitty Merle died, that was how I got through some of the most painful moments of grieving. Of course, it also helps knowing that others have done this and gotten through it. The vast majority of human beings have had to grieve the death of someone they loved. And somehow we get through it. But we don't get through it in thinking that it's the rest of our life. We get through it just one moment at a time. Okay, I'm going to keep going with this. You know, when we read a book or we hear a story or we watch a movie, we're watching it on speed dial. I mean, we're watching it so sped up that it almost lulls us into believing that that's the way it really is. We think that things are going to move really quickly, and if they don't, there's something wrong. But the truth is, just like our bodies heal slowly, when you look at them from 1 minute to the next, a deep wound, it does heal over time. But if we're looking at it after 5 minutes and wondering why it hasn't healed, well, that would be ridiculous, right? We would never do that. We understand that it's going to take weeks, maybe even months, and that one day we'll look back and there's just a faint scar. But when it comes to emotions, sometimes it's hard to remember that. And we want to leapfrog ahead. But it just doesn't work that way, and it certainly doesn't work that way with something like addiction. There's no leapfrogging. There's no moving ahead at a quicker pace. But one day, if we can just keep healing 1 minute at a time, one day, years later, we look back and there's just a faint scar. So to me, the act of hand stitching, it's such a great reminder, one stitch at a time, of just that. We can't leapfrog ahead. And why would we want to? There's a process here, a beautiful process. And if we allow it to, it can be of growth. I think. It's certainly something I can reference. When I'm doing other things that seem to just go on interminably and I feel impatient, if I can get that slow stitch mindset into whatever it is, well, then I might have a shot at actually enjoying the process. So what I've done here, I like doing things a little differently each time, just kind of experimenting and seeing what that's going to be like. And so this time I took this base fabric, this base linen that I had, and I had a single cast on bouillon rose that I'd made. And then I thought, well, I'll do a video and I'll experiment and show how to make those. And then I thought, well, it'd be fun to show how to incorporate other materials, sort of to change things up. And so I added this wool, which I'm kind of pulling apart. And then I started adding more. And now here I am doing my stitching, which is just kind of mindless and repetitive. And I get to just kind of be and enjoy the process of just running a needle through fabric and creating something else, transforming this one little piece of blue linen. It's not even, it's a factory dyed, all one piece, but layering it with other things, other materials, newspaper, ads from who knows what, some magazine, materials that I made, with that water-soluble stabilizer, threads, cheesecloth, wool, burlap, and I get to just be kind of mindless and just stitch away. And if I get bored of the pink, I can move on to some other color. And I think maybe I'll couch this piece down, but I want to stitch this one down next, I think. I can add a little pink in this material, and why not? Why not let the pink go up into this cream? Keeping my stitches fairly small for this area. I don't know why, just felt like it. I think I'll just do a little bit more here. I just continue to stitch down these very different materials that I've pinned here. And I haven't even looked to see where I might put these on the metal frame, but I'm pretty confident that I can make this work. And the beautiful thing about this is I can just add stuff as I see needed once I get to that point. But for now, I'm really just at this stitching it all together. And one of the things that I'm thinking about as I'm stitching is I'm thinking about how I'm using different materials that I've used in all the other spheres prior to this one, and how that's important for this piece, this sphere, because this sphere is all about stitching together a new way of life. And the way one does that is not to try and erase the past. That's not possible. The only way to really make lasting change, at least this is my experience, is in confronting the past, acknowledging it, and then finding other ways to live. So that day that I lay on the floor, that day was the beginning of something I couldn't possibly know at that moment how significant it was going to be. I couldn't know that. I could hope, but I couldn't possibly fully take in how significant that first day was going to be. That first day when I refused to give in to old destructive ways of living my life, that I had to find other ways. And it happened slowly. It didn't happen the way it does in a movie or even in a book. And at times it felt impossible. But every time I started to get panicked or feeling like it was impossible, I had to bring myself back to the present. And to me, this kind of stitching is just such a great reminder of that very slow, very methodical, taking one stitch at a time. I've also always been drawn to the aesthetic of something being placed, something new being placed over something old, but not entirely obscuring it. Having that little bit of old showing through. I'll never forget that movie Wall Street that came out. And in it, there's a shot of somebody, I don't know, maybe the main character, I can't even remember. I really don't remember the movie much at all. But there was a shot of a New York City apartment, and you could see the wall. There was a part of the wall where the bare brick underneath was showing. And I always loved that. I've never forgotten that. Of that entire movie, that's all I really remember. I can't remember the plot much. I mean, I know it was about, like, I don't know, stock exchange, traders, money, whatever, greed. But I don't remember anything else. I couldn't even tell you who was in it. But I do remember that. It was so powerful to me, and I just loved it. And now, when I bought this loft where we now live in New York City, all the brick was painted, and I wanted to expose it. I wanted to expose that red adobe brick color. I didn't want it to be painted over. And so, not entirely, not everywhere, as it was when we moved in. It was completely, every bit of it was painted over. So in our bedroom, we sandblasted the paint off, and we have a whole portion that's the bare brick, and I love that. But I also just love the idea of the original part of something being exposed. I was always fascinated by painters who would paint something, be unhappy with it, and then use that canvas and paint over the original painting. I always wanted to know what that original, or at least to be shown what that original painting was. It was something that really fascinated me and continues to. It's, I think, one of the reasons I really love Rauschenberg. Rauschenberg is, he really used collage a lot, and that's what I love about collage and a lot of abstract art, where something is done and then something is put, a kind of transparent whatever it is. That's one of the reasons I love using that tissue paper, that deli paper, because it's transparent enough that you can see a glimpse of what's beneath. And to me, that is so, I just love that. I love seeing a little glimpse of what's beneath. I've always been fascinated by psychology and cases of different neurologies, different ways of seeing things. There's this really fascinating thing. It's quite unusual. It's rare, but it's called synesthesia. And autistic people in particular have much higher cases of having synesthesia than others, than the non-autistic population. And what's really interesting about synesthesia is that it is where the different senses can be mixed. So, in other words, a color can have sound to it. So someone who's a synesthete may be able, one of the things that happens for them is that color isn't just a color that they see, it's also a sound that they hear. And the same can be said for music. So they can listen to music and see color. So that's just one example. But there are other aspects of this that are really fascinating. So I spoke with one autistic person who told me they were a synesthete, and the way that it played out for them was that when they were letters had personalities, and it made it really hard for them to put some letters next to each other because they knew that they didn't get along. It was so interesting. So, and now I'm just making this up for an example, but so let's say the letter T. The letter T might be really friendly and gregarious, but then the letter H was angry and confrontational. And so when you put the letter T and the letter H together, they were always fighting. And it was really just incredible. The different, when I had this conversation, a lot of other people who were synesthetes entered into the conversation and were telling me about the different ways that their synesthesia affected them, and it was just absolutely incredible. I mean, very, very, just fascinating. And I love things like that. I love how the different ways in which we humans will adapt. The things that have happened to us will find ways to adapt. And I think the ways in which we adapt to the things that have occurred in our lives can be incredibly helpful and kind of ingenious often. And so it's not about erasing it or pretending it didn't exist. It's about looking at these things and making sure that the ways we've adapted aren't hurting us. And if they are, finding different ways of coping. For a long time, my eating disorder was an elaborate way of coping with the things that I had experienced. And so that's really hard to change if it isn't recognized as being a coping mechanism. It was my way to cope. It wasn't a great way. It was an incredibly destructive way, but nevertheless, it was a way to cope. And so I had to learn different ways to cope. You can't just get rid of that and then expect everything to be fine. It's not going to be fine. You've just removed a coping skill, but you haven't replaced it with anything else. So that's kind of what this is to me. This is all about taking scraps from the past and finding different ways to stitch it all together to create something new, hopefully something better, or at least something really interesting. It's a way of stitching to become whole. I think when there's tremendous violence as a child that you have experienced and witnessed, you become hyper vigilant. It's just what you learn to do. The problem with hypervigilance is that it can cause other other problems. So you become, and it's really kind of interesting, I think, you become both distrustful, wary, and on edge, constantly looking for the next, when's the shoe going to drop kind of thing. But you also can be incredibly trusting to people that you shouldn't be. Which is interesting. You'd think you wouldn't be, you'd think that you'd just be. But for some people, when there's violence, especially this is something you grew up with, you're taught to obey people who should not be obeyed. But you're trained to obey them. It's you. There's the looming fear that if you don't, you're going to be met with that violence, which can be horrific, especially if it was extreme and where you feared for your life or you feared for someone else's life. That all becomes really real. And so disobeying, that's just not in the cards. And often, unfortunately, with violence, there's also a lot of emotional manipulation that can happen. So for me, as a little girl, when I did something wrong, I was taught that not only had I done this terrible thing, but that now I needed to come up with a suitable punishment. Well, that was something that happened all the time. They would say, well, what do you think would be an adequate punishment? And of course, so you become complicit in your own demise. Because, of course, as a child, you learn to believe that there is no adequate punishment. There's nothing that could punish you enough. I learned that lesson very well, and I was very young. I think the younger you are, and the longer it goes on, the more damaging all of that becomes. And so I became really good at punishing myself. And then I spent a lifetime unlearning all of that and trying to learn how to be a different way, which thankfully I have done. This fear is all about that day when I couldn't know, as I lay on the floor of my apartment, looking up at the skylight. I couldn't possibly know the significance. But that's what this sphere is about. It's about the very slow, often incredibly difficult and painful road to healing. The sphere is about honoring that. When you're thinking in these terms, everything becomes a metaphor, right? So I was thinking as the thread was tangling, well, that's appropriate. Because the tangled, knotted thread becomes a metaphor for all those moments that aren't easy, where things don't go as planned, where things are really hard, where you think, maybe I should just go back to the old way. It would be easier. But then you say, no, I'm not going to do that. And even though at the time it doesn't feel like you're paving the way towards self-love, it is. It is self-love. Every step you take where you're not continuing to behave in a destructive way is a step taken in self-love. So as I stitch, I'm not thinking about how long this is going to take or when am I going to be finished. I'm just really enjoying this moment of quiet and calm. And then you can zoom out and see how far you've come. And that then propels you to continue. Thanks so much for watching, and if this resonated for you at all, I'd love it if you subscribed. It's always great. Comment. I love your comments. And hit that thumbs up button. It helps with the algorithm. Thanks so much, everyone, and let's keep creating.